As we begin today's video, I'd like to send out a thanks and a tip of the hat to Daniel's Hot Topics, who often sends us articles that are germane to what we talk about here. And we'll talk about some of the things that we've read about the second season of Picard after this. Hello out there, I'm the oldest nerd, and on this video we're going to talk about the characters that we have not yet seen in Star Trek Picard. There was an interview with Levar Burton, and he had said, "I'm not sure how much I can say here. Generally speaking, if somebody is not going to be involved in a future project, they generally say, well, nobody's called me yet." But if someone says, "I'm not sure I can say anything," it fairly much confirms that there's going to be some involvement by LeVar Burton, and only fair that it should be. Let's first of all take some of the things that have been mentioned in print elsewhere. They point out that LeVar Burton, of course, was the first picked for Star Trek: The Next Generation. He was the biggest name in it at the time. He was still celebrating his celebrity from being the younger Kunta Kinte in the miniseries Roots, which was wildly popular not too many years before Star Trek: The Next Generation came out. So it was a great catch on the part of Paramount to be able to grab LeVar Burton as the first cast member hired. LeVar Burton was a big participant not only in The Next Generation, but in the prequel comic book and book to the Picard series. Geordi is one of the first people that Picard picks to build his team in order to create the necessary infrastructure for the Romulan rescue. Now, as you recall, the backstory on Picard is that the Romulan star was going nova. They knew about it about a year before it was going to happen, and the Federation set out a big rescue attempt for the Romulans and put Picard in charge of it. He had to give up the Enterprise. It's told that Worf was given command of the Enterprise, and the first person that he picked for his special team was Geordi to be stationed at Utopia Planitia, the shipyards on Mars, where the Armada was to be built in order to transport all the Romulans. The ships that they had, some of the starships that they had were large enough that could be repurposed, but in order to deal with nearly 1 billion people in the Romulan star system, they were going to have to build every ship that they could, and so they needed someone to head that up, and Geordi was an obvious choice. Now, like everything else that happened during that time, the Romulans were not liking the idea that the Federation was rescuing them. They never really trusted the Federation to be completely altruistic in their efforts to help them. They thought it was a way to spy on them, to subjugate themselves to Federation rule, and did not like it. And there were planets in the Federation, especially along the Romulan border, that did not like the idea that a lot of resources of the Federation were going to save the Romulans and not going to the outer planets, things that they needed in order to more fully develop the planets they were on, industrial replicators and things such as that, in order to build more infrastructure for these planets. So there was problems on both sides, and of course Picard and Raffi Musiker, his lead aide and eventually first officer, was most affected by this. Obviously, Picard put his career on the line when the Federation wanted to back out of this after the synthetics attack on Mars. Raffi, of course, being Picard's second in command, was also affected when Picard resigned. She became kind of a pariah in the Federation and was discharged from Starfleet and had to make it on her own. That led into a tailspin of a broken family, of drug abuse, and things such as that. Now, we don't know exactly what happened to Geordi. Now, Geordi was on Utopia Planitia, but according to the prequel book, he had left the world somewhat before the synthetics had revolted and was off planet at the time all this happened. So we don't really know where he went. The book was vague about it. The comics, of course, happened before the end of the book, and so it was all the organization that Geordi had in order to build all these ships was to have synthetics manufactured in order to do some of the things that could not be replicated. So Geordi could have suffered as well as Raffi and Picard did as far as the repercussions of the Romulan rescue. Or he could have been still valuable in rebuilding the fleet. At this point, all of these ships had been built, and then once they quit being used by the Romulans, they had to be rebuilt into something that the Federation could use. And we suspect that this fleet of brand new ships that were led by Riker in the last episode of the Picard season was perhaps these ships that were originally meant to transport the Romulans, and now they've been made into regular starships, and very powerful starships at that. So what we have here is a situation where something had to happen in between the time that these were transports and these were brand new starships. And so I'm thinking that Geordi had to have something to do with that. And so we expect between this gap in the story and the public statements of Levar Burton that he's got to be the next person in Picard in season 2. Now, they were still writing it last that we heard, and of course filming has not begun yet, but Levar Burton would have already heard whether they wanted him or not, so they could write the story around him, and he could be as big a part of the next story arc as Data was in the first season. So where we were dealing with the synthetics and the re-indoctrination into the Federation as Picard becomes a synthetic himself, we have Geordi, who may have been the person that rebuilt the fleet and maybe is in some way going to be connected to Picard in some way or other. Perhaps Picard's android-esque body is going to need someone who is familiar with positronic networks, as Geordi is. This is something that is very possible. Other characters we have not heard from yet. Of course, we've already heard from Data, of course, in flashback. We've heard from Troy and Riker, who had started a family and had moved to Nepenthe. We had heard from, of course, 7 of 9. But what we have not heard from is Worf. Last known was the captain of the Enterprise, and then Beverly Crusher. I found it interesting that in the early episodes of Picard that the doctor who diagnosed his brain problem was actually his chief medical officer on the Stargazer, who happens to live not far from him, I guess, or with transporter technology, he could live on the other side of the world, I suppose. As it is, why would he pick this character we've not seen before and not Beverly? And so there's got to be some backstory with Beverly as well. Now, we have not had any indication that they had been married, as they were in the Q episode, or the last episode of TNG. This was something that, as usual, was a Q trick and not necessarily showing the future that was actually going to happen, but one that Q had manipulated. So what we have here is an unknown as far as Beverly is concerned, but once again, back to LeVar Burton's interview, where he said, we probably won't see everybody all at once, but we probably will see everybody. And so we'll expect to see Beverly somewhere as the story leads to it, if not in this season, perhaps in a third if they decide to go to a third season. I expect only maybe a one-episode shot for her, although I expect that Geordi might be in an entire season as Data was. That only leaves, like I said, Worf and Wesley. It's uncertain as to whether Wesley is going to be seen at all. There hasn't been any kind of indication that Will Wheaton is going to be part of this, even though he is contracted still to do the after show for Picard, so maybe that's going to be his role. And we don't know how Worf is going to fit in, except that he probably, even after all these years, is still in command of the Enterprise. The command tends to last a long time in Starfleet. In fact, I was almost surprised when it was Riker rather than Worf that came to Picard's rescue, although they had already established that Riker had a reserve activation clause in his contract, so he could jump back, and so that made sense. So anyway, that's just some musing on what might happen in a distant season 2 of Picard, but some things to think about and some things that are being talked about. So I hope you have some ideas, and if you do, please put them in the comments below. I'd love to read them. Also, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you know when the next video is coming your way. And until then, hope everyone is doing well. We're still fine. We are without any kind of sickness or infection at this point. So we are among the lucky ones. We hope that you are too. So till next time, don't go far.